Дорогие друзья, спасибо за ваш интерес к мероприятию Utalks.Boundaryless, цикл онлайн-эфиров с международными экспертами, который в течение года будет проводить Universal University, первый университет креативных индустрий в России. Первый цикл эфиров мы проводим при поддержке отдела культуры и образования Посольства Великобритании в Москве. Сегодня мы будем обсуждать тему брендинга и его роли в карьере в креативных индустриях. И если вы смотрите нас в Zoom, пожалуйста, нажмите на значок «Планета» внизу экрана. Вы можете выбрать русский язык, потому что эта дискуссия пройдет на английском языке. В течение всего эфира вы можете задавать вопросы в чат и писать вопросы как на русском, так и на английском языках. Мы обязательно передадим все вопросы нашему модератору Майклу. Сегодня нашим гостем нашего эфира является Брент Мейхью, декан факультета визуальных коммуникаций, дизайна и прикладных искусств университета Solent Великобритании. Университет Solent входит в 100 лучших университетов Великобритании. Карьерный центр Solent имеет собственное креативное агентство, которое поддерживает фрилансеров. Брент Мейхью, декан факультета визуальных коммуникаций, дизайна и прикладных искусств, 25 лет работал в креативном секторе, сперва в роли старшего графического дизайнера в газетах The Times и The Sunday Times, затем на посту креативного директора в различных онлайн-агентствах, включая Create Media. Брент имеет степень магистра по графическому дизайну, который получил в London College of Communication. Сегодня модерирует нашу сессию преподаватель Universal University Майкл Гибсон. Он преподаватель бакалаврских программ по маркетингу, рекламе и диджитал-маркетингу в Британской высшей школе дизайна. Также он является управляющим и креативным директором агентства Utalks, имеет степень магистра изящных искусств из университета Оксфорда. Hi Brent, hi Mike, nice to meet you and thank you so much for joining the session. It is a pleasure for us to have you with us today. And I would like just to hand this over to you, Mike, and I'm sure that it will be a very exciting and interesting conversation for all our audience. Just would like to remind that it is able to ask questions throughout the session. So please, your questions are very welcome. Thank you so much, Mike. Brent, it's up to you.
Thank you very much, Dasha, for that great introduction. Привет всем, and we will now be speaking in English. We are very honored to have Brent with us today. As Dasha already said, he's from Solent University in the UK. And if you don't know where that is, the Solent is actually a stretch of water between the south coast of the mainland UK and a small island called the Isle of Wight. It's a very beautiful part of the world. And actually, it's one of the busiest waterways in the world with lots of shipping and yachts. Today, Brent will talk about branding. He has some great examples to share with us, covering branding in all its different manifestations, from big industry to personal branding, to the role of famous personalities behind brands, and much, much more. But before that, I'd just like to take a step back. Brent has had a very interesting career. Dash has already spoken a little bit about some of the highlights. But I'd like just to add that it spans several decades that have seen huge changes and required lots of reinvention and adoption of many new technologies. When Brent started, there were in fact no iPhones, and the Mac had just arrived on the scene. I think I'm right in saying that, Brent, that the Mac was just coming in the sort of mid-late 80s.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, the very first one I worked on was just black and white. They didn't have.
Brilliant. And then over the years, you've had to think about brands of your clients, the brands of the advertising company that you yourself founded, and then about your own brand, and also the personal brands of the students who you now send out into the real world looking for jobs. So you'll be telling us more about that during the talk. Very interestingly, when you started in the mid-80s, it was a very famous time where sort of technologies kind of crashed against each other. It was the notorious moment of the Wapping strikes, when the printers' unions were disputing the introduction of new technology, basically the Apple Mac and digital production. And this new technology basically meant that you could now print a newspaper with 90% less staff than before. So there are a lot of redundancies as physical typesetting was replaced with digital technology. And Brent was part of the kind of the bright young things that were moved into a special new factory place in the new Wapping plant. And you guys are kind of part of the future, bringing new technology to print and then to all the communication industries. And over the years, you've seen brands come and go, as well as new technologies that help us build those brands. Since the 80s, your career's done all sorts of interesting things. Brent has started his own ad agency. Brent has worked in a war zone. He has a soldiering career as well, which is very interesting. And he now heads up the visual communication, design and applied arts at Solent University. In that role, he's responsible for overseeing the operational running of many creative courses, but also has oversight for the Solent University's recruitment and exchange programs around the world, in Europe and the Far East and places like India and China. So Brent has had a vast experience, seen all sorts of changes, and actually sort of seen technology right from the beginning of its sort of incredible onslaught and change. So let's get right into branding. Tell us something about branding, Brent. I know you've got some interesting work to share with us, particularly at the start. You've got some classic and famous examples. Take us away.
Fantastic, great. Well, thank you very much for having me here to have to talk to you about branding. It's one of my favourite subjects. I'm very much an illustrator, graphic designer, but to me, it's the ethos behind branding. And I kind of want to talk to you about this. Is like sort of we want to go over what is branding, why it's important, and then why it should really matter to you. So I'm just going to change a couple of slides. Hopefully, this will work as good as gold. So I love this. This is by Jeff Bezos, founder of Amazon. Your brand is what other people say about you when you're not in the room. It's not just a pretty picture. It's not a logo. It's not something really clever. It's something far more than that. And we say a brand is a personality that identifies a product, service, or I'd like to talk about it, even a person. So, we were just talking about, famous brands. And when we talk about that, we talk about something called brand value. A brand has real value. A brand can be so powerful that a simple thing can identify it. I mean, we were talking about this, I think, before we were off screen, saying this is the new brand for Burger King, but it's still closely aligned to what they've had in the past. And, this is an international company. Wherever you go in the world, when you walk into Burger King, apart from some slight changes and maybe the language that somebody talks to you in, it's going to be the same. As is Rolex. And it's interesting. I love these two because they're two brands that are opposite, but they have a real thing in common. I don't know if you can see it. So we got Rolex saying it's the very best of watches that you can possibly buy from Switzerland, and Burger King. And they share two things. They're trying to get that whole royalty across in their brand. It's why I like them so much. And even a simple mark, a simple tick on a piece of paper can tell you everything about this brand. I kind of hope that gets the first bits across to you, Michael.
Yeah, that's some great examples, and all those brands have been around for a very long time. So tell me, I saw this when we were going through the slides, making an apology for Pepsi. I thought this looked very interesting. What's going on here?
Well, I don't know if this is the same in Russia, but in England, and in fact, I've even had this happen to me abroad. I'll go into a bar and I'll say straight away, can I have a Coke? I might be driving, I might have a business meeting, can I have a Coke? And then straight away the first thing is, it's become this joke. It's the joke strapline for Pepsi now. It's, oh, sorry, it's Pepsi, is that okay? That's because Coca-Cola as a brand is so strong worldwide that even the main subject, the actual drink itself, is called a Coke. Spelt differently, but it's actually a Coke. In the same way as in our own country, in the UK, for us, when we clean a room, we vacuum clean a room. But actually, one of the most interesting things is we often call it hoovering, because a Hoover is a company that makes them. So, yeah, I find that very interesting, Michael. I love the fact that, you know, you can actually have someone apologize to you because the brand is so strong.
Yeah, it's the same. We have words like Xerox, don't we, for photocopying.
Yeah.
Similar type of thing. And that is an indication of a brand having achieved, is that a very good thing when a brand has got to that stage? Or does it actually present some problems when people start using the brand name as a generic verb almost for things like hoovering or for Xeroxing?
It's really interesting. It's really interesting. You'd think that it would cause problems. Take Coca-Cola, for example. There's worldwide, there is thousands and thousands of companies that make Coke. When they were approached, they were asked about it. Oh, what do you think about this? They say, this is the best thing that could ever happen in the world. It's everyone is doing free advertising for us that we're not having to pay for. When you're that powerful, all of a sudden, it's almost like we call it gaining traction. Your brand gains traction. It's got a world of its own, a life of its own, becomes a word. So actually, as long as there's nothing negative with that brand, you couldn't want for anything better to happen to be associated with whatever it is that your brand stands for.
So essentially, you become the category in a way, don't you? You become, it's all about Coke. It's all about hoovering. It's all about Xeroxing. That actually is the action that all the other brands are doing, which is interesting. Yes. Now, tell me a little bit more about branding and why is it so important for brands?
Well, I've jumped onto this next slide here. It's like I've talked about brand value, and it's a set of principles that dictate the brand, the message, the look, the personality. Is it important? Yes. Massively important. I mean, we've got a couple of case studies that I often throw in here, which I'll talk about in a minute, which kind of really show up. If you get something wrong, it can affect your brand massively worldwide. There's no two ways about it. And we're seeing, for example, incredibly volatile share prices with some companies simply because the brand just keeps changing its message. So it's really important to keep this message, this look, this personality. And we always say, when you're looking for that, this is the consistency. We're always saying you've got to discover what matters about your brand, got to know your competitors and your customers. You've got to stand for something. But I love this one at the end. You must be consistent. That's, I think, is what we're trying to get at, Michael. You must be consistent in everything you do. Right.
It's really interesting. And I see you had, when we were talking, you had some examples of comparing brands in categories. You were talking about brands that are kind of in similar industries, such as Microsoft and Apple. Here we go.
Straight to
two huge players, but in very different ways to very different markets. So, in fact, it's very interesting looking at those two logos next to each other. It kind of sums up the creative world of Apple and the sort of Excel spreadsheets of Microsoft.
It's one of my favorite little stories to talk about. I mean, everyone thinks they know about it because we're all touched by it quite often. You know, all of us use a PC, a personal computer, but many of us don't realize the real story behind this. These two companies came out pretty much at the same time. They developed the mouse and the interface we use, so the personal computer. And Apple in particular was started by this guy, Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs starts up Apple and then he leaves. And the really interesting thing for me when you look at their branding is I can tell you exactly when he left and when he came back. You can see he leaves about 1997. Why? Just look at the brand. This is the history of the brand. It comes back in 1998. They hadn't bothered to change their brand. The company was really losing out. Microsoft was absolutely everywhere. And then suddenly Steve Jobs came back and he said he took control of the brand. He made sure everything was on brand. Literally, the technology, the way in which things were made, everything looks the same. Everything, real great thought has gone into the simplicity of the packaging. Every single thing you pick up, you know, that lovely, if you've ever bought an iPhone new, that lovely feeling that you take the phone out of the box, or this, I'm sat in front of an iMac because I just love the fact that, you know, just the way it's all delivered. The buildings. Now, I often talk about it to international students, and in a lot of countries, they don't have Apple shops. But here you are within the UK and a lot of other places, we have Apple shops. And these beautiful, iconic buildings that people want to go into. And that you can tell where he controlled the brand. And the rest is history. Now, all of a sudden, rather than for myself being the only person that maybe on a train is using a Mac laptop, now everyone is. That's how powerful the brand is.
And it's a very sort of tactile, it's a very sensory experience, isn't it, with Mac, in a way that Microsoft is not. There isn't much joy in using any of that stuff. And of course, they have more been imitating Apple, haven't they, in terms of trying to make the design experience much more pleasurable.
They have. There's been lots of talk about this within graphic design industries, because one of the things, when Steve Jobs went, when he died, would it continue? And it has. They've kept that simplicity right the way through. Whereas Microsoft, I feel, have been playing a catch-up game. They've tried to simplify their branding, their logo, their packaging. They had this horribly overworked process in everything they were doing, and they really are playing a catch-up game. But one of their problems is the way in which their business model works. Apple control everything manufacturing-wise. Microsoft allow anyone to manufacture and make computers with their software within. So therefore, they don't have that total control over everything to do with the brand.
Right, that's very interesting. Yeah, because they're open source, aren't they? So which means that they can basically let co-creators, manufacturers basically build their products.
Yeah.
It's a very interesting point. Now, Brent, you have spent yourself some time in the military, right? You were in your late teens, early 20s before you actually started out in printing. You actually served in the British Army, and then I think just over 10 years ago, you were saying you went to Afghanistan on a mission to win hearts and minds. Now,
Yeah.
to give you an interesting perspective on branding with kind of a military cap on. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, it's I started off, wanted to be in the army, joined the army, enjoyed it, came out, loved my artwork, and the rest is history. I've become very much an artist, into branding and that. And then I found a period about 10 years ago, I had this lovely little gap in my life in between careers, and I thought, I really fancy doing something different. So I joined up what are the reserve forces of my own country, and they took one look at what I do in the world, and they said, got the perfect job for you. You're going to go on tour to Afghanistan, great, and you're going to be what we call an influence officer. Okay, fine. So I started to read the paperwork and realized this is branding. You are asking me to get the brand of ISAF, the entire organization, across to the Afghan people. And it was ever so interesting, working completely differently. And it's made me think of branding in a completely different way. I've suddenly come back and realized that, well, as I've got here, the unspoken masters of branding without a word that no one ever talks about are the armed services of any and all countries. You think about it, everything about the armed services in every country you're in is about creating that literally unique single entity. The uniforms, the consistency in the uniforms, in many cases, like, for example, this regiment is in an old uniforms that were designed so they could be easily seen on a battlefield. Not anymore. Now it's about...
Immediately I know there's the Coldstream Guards, right?
Correct.
On the slide before were the Russian paratroopers.
Yeah, sorry, it's got to be in there. I should explain to my Russian colleagues, I'm a former paratrooper. So there's no way I wouldn't have started off without paratroopers. Straight.
No, but potentially, because I'm not a paratrooper and I'm not a military guy, but these guys actually have very distinct branding: the blue berets and the stripy shirts, and they have a flag which there's a day there's this sort of celebration, Paratroopers Day, when you see a lot of these guys out kind of celebrating, often remembering fallen comrades. So you see the blue cap, you see the stripy shirt, and you often see their flag.
And that's what I love, because that's all part of that belonging, that branding. As you said, this is the British Army, Grenadier Guards.
The Grenadier, sorry. Mm-hmm.
And it's all aimed to do one thing. It's aimed to make you feel like you belong. It doesn't matter where your background is, what you've done in the past. It's all about you belong to something bigger than you. That's what branding is. And why I always show this is because I love to show the next picture. This explains why McDonald's and everyone else uses uniforms. They're trying to do the same thing. They're trying to make you part, when you work for them, of that bigger thing, the brand.
It's very interesting. But there could be, I mean, when we cut, the military thing is very interesting. But that could also scare people off a bit. There's some people, when they see guards or soldiers kind of on parade, they immediately take a step back, and there's a slightly fearful thing. But you said something about belonging to something bigger than you. That I think is quite an interesting comment. But how do you balance against the sort of the possible negative of something that, I mean, because you could, if you were to put, for example, a picture of the Nazi SS up there, that would have been very scary. It would have done and that's a branding, but in a sort of more terrible.
But that's one of the most interesting things. That is a brand. So you've hit the nail on the head. You put something up like that. It's you're worried. You know what that stands for. You know the history behind it. And that is a really interesting point. That tells you why some brands work, you know. So, for example, let's go back to the Russian paratroopers. You're revered. You know that what they're there to protect you. So therefore, they're genuinely held in high esteem. Get something wrong, and you're quite right, the brand can go the other way. And that's something that's really, really important. And then you come down to the last picture I showed you, is just, this is what you're trying to achieve. Someone who's so happy to be there with his friends, he or she feels they're part of something.
That's very interesting. Yeah, and I think there's a lot. There's such a very interesting cases there. Now you've also, when it comes to branding, in fact, you've mentioned Steve Jobs earlier on with Apple. Now, some brands are very closely identified with a founder or a principal figure or a very charismatic personality who kind of drives the brand. You know, whenever they open their mouth, their share price goes up or goes down. Tell us a little bit more about personalities behind brands.
Well, it's a really interesting thing. You think a brand is just, let's look at Steve Jobs. We spoke about him earlier, the Apple. And I said something which I think is really important, is when he did die, it continued. And that's an interesting thing. But there's no two ways about it. The period he was there, he was in charge. And that's why I always think a single person can massively affect the brand. If we think of Virgin, worldwide company based in the UK, run by this guy, Richard Branson. He is incredibly well known. He's well known because he puts himself at the center of everything his brand is about. Every single time Virgin brings out a new enterprise, he will always be there at the beginning to discuss it, to talk about it, to publicize it. He's always doing PR stunts of some kind. You know, when one of his ships goes off into space finding with people on it, I'm sure he'll be there. He's a good example of doing it fantastically well. He's consistent. Nothing ever changes. That smile never goes away. Yeah. But I just don't get this. I think Tesla is one of the most amazing companies in the world, and how you cannot like everything they make, and yet their share prices keep going down. They keep going up and down all over the place. And that's because I feel very strongly that whether their founder likes it or not, when people see him, they associate him with everything he's involved with, which means Tesla. And so therefore, every time he does something, and I think, you know, he just doesn't really, he wants to be independent and be an independent thinker. The trouble is that is having a direct effect on his brand all the time. And there's that lack of consistency.
Right. That's it. There is a lack of consistency. And he's a maverick, isn't he? He sort of, there are good days with him and there are bad days, aren't there? You don't really know quite what you're going to get. Whereas with Richard Branson, that smile always seems to be there, doesn't it? He's more consistent in the sense that Richard Branson, I think of as someone that's who's always after a challenge. He has done a lot of extreme sports, hasn't he? So he's sailed across the Atlantic and something. He's done a balloon challenge of some sort. He's always taking these things on.
Well, that's very interesting because when you talk about across the Atlantic, he actually raced in a speedboat across the Atlantic to get something called the Blue Ribbon, which was. Right. And why I'm smiling is because some of the people who worked on the design of that boat were ex-students of ours at Solent, and the boat now it's Solent.
It was the Solent University, of course, which is one of the principal boating shipping places in the UK. Right, very interesting. Whereas when you get to Elon Musk, he sort of has grumpy days, doesn't he? And he has sort of good days, and his share price kind of almost reflects that.
It's very interesting because you see something else as well. I don't put any slides in about it here. Didn't really want to, but think about politicians as well. Richard Branson knows to keep consistent, keep smiling regardless of what the question is. Elon Musk, he will answer the question, and he's quite happy to be drawn into a conversation. I think he's trying to be extremely honest in what he does, but it does have an effect. And when he's having a bad day, we all know it. Yeah,
and the share price reflects it. Yeah. Anyway, now as mentioned, you also we saw earlier on the new Burger King logo, which because that was only introduced at the end of last year, I think, which was a big change. They actually went back and looked at some of their earlier logo designs, which was interesting. And they, of course, not just redesigned the logo, but they've redesigned all the packaging, all the different touch points, the uniforms, etc., etc. So how do brands cope with change and transform over the years while actually still trying to maintain consistency?
Well, that's really interesting because Burger King's a great one to start with because they also remind me something of a well-known European fuel brand, Shell, which sells gasoline. Shell have kept a very similar brand all the way through their logo. And a lot of people with what Burger King did, a lot of people believe that Burger King had gone too far off their brand and they came back. And I find that fascinating. But sometimes it's not even changing that logo. The logo doesn't need to change. It's the brand. A great example for me would be Land Rover.
Right.
Really good example because a famous British company, been around since about 1948, making these Land Rovers. And Land Rovers are famously indestructible. They are a military utilitarian vehicle, great. But then it started to go wrong in the late 90s or mid 90s sort of thing. And it was like, well, no matter what we do, we're going wrong. Why are people not buying our brand? And this, for example, was one of the last Land Rovers they made, a little Freelander. You can see what the advert's saying. Oh, look, we're indestructible. But their problem was that. And so they were bought by a large European company, BMW. BMW brought in a fantastic large branding company in and said, look, what's wrong? And they said, what's wrong is you don't understand what your brand is seen as with your customers. You see, for example, this is one of the early Range Rovers, a top-of-the-range Range Rover. You see it covered in mud. Your customers don't. 99.9% of them will never go anywhere near the countryside in it. It is literally an urban tractor, as we call it. And overnight, they changed the branding, but they didn't change the logo. The logo stays the same. Land Rover has never changed. What they changed was the opinion of the company had of itself. Suddenly, they realized that what people wanted was a mini Range Rover, such as this. They got this whole idea and they changed absolutely everything about that, which was a brand.
So the Land Rover logo has not changed, is that right, over the years?
No. So if we go back, this logo is still the same. They're still using it, but what they've done is they've shown that it's what is attached to that logo. What we think when we see that logo now has changed from this or this to now this.
Right, that's very interesting. So in fact, the logo's stayed the same, but the meaning behind it has changed.
Yeah,
that's interesting because a lot of companies think they have to change the logo because that's going to change the meaning. But in fact, it's the other way around. They've got to change the meaning, and actually, the logo isn't the key to changing that meaning. It's about
and that's what was so fascinating about Burger King. Burger King realised they had to go back to their origins. That they'd moved too far away from their original brand.
Right. So there are times to keep it and there are times to change it, which is interesting. The key is to know when. Now, there's a lot of stuff behind brands. I mean, we've talked about personalities, we've talked about logos, but there are things like assets, which are all the sort of stuff, the kind of photography, the colors, the typography, all the things that actually embody and explain and convey a brand to customers and to the users. How important is that, and how do we get that right?
Well, this is an interesting thing. If wherever you are, if you go and search on a search engine, and I promise you, wherever you are, if you go, say, for example, you think of a big company like Apple, and you put Apple brand guidelines, you will find a free document you can download. And big companies produce this big document because they know they need to control what they call the brand assets. That is all the things that are used with it. So this is an example, for example, these are the brand guidelines for Land Rover. I downloaded them free of charge. Now, the reason is quite simple, because that means that anyone in the world working on Land Rover will be able to download these. They'll know exactly the sort of photography they should use. And in fact, there'll be links here to getting free photography to actually use. They'll be able to know exactly what the tone of language is, regardless of what country and what language you actually translate that into, what pictures you can use, what you can't use, even, the typography. And 9 times out of 10, you'll also be able to download this and actually load it on your own computer, whether it's a PC or a Mac or anything. The whole point of this is to get consistency so that wherever that brand is used in the world, it's the same message. Do you remember what I said to you right at the very beginning? Wherever you go to a Burger King, you know what you're going to get. The language will be different, slight different taste maybe in bread occasionally, but everything else will be the same. That is all managed through the brand assets.
Right, and that's absolutely key to making a brand kind of consistent across different touch points around the world. Because also, if you think about something like Starbucks, another big worldwide brand, obviously everywhere, and wherever you go, the experience is always the same. But they're also very good at working with their staff, which I think is interesting, because it's not just things like the photography and the typography, etc. Also, the people are important as well, right? I mean, you have to get that right too.
Then, and that's again why you come back to that uniform. Sometimes you see that belonging, that way of creating everyone pulling in the same direction. So an awful lot of work within large companies, you're quite right, has gone into an educational system for their employees. McDonald's have their own university and their own sort of teaching practices to get across to their employees what it means to be someone who works for McDonald's. And so, it's vitally important that everyone in the company actually understands what the brand is and what that stands for.
And it's very key, because often those are the sort of ambassadors, they're the touch points to the brand. When you come in, your point of contact is a person taking your order, or who greets you when you walk into a Starbucks. And I'm always very impressed with Starbucks, because they always make a point of saying good morning when you go in, saying hello, and then they kind of they name your cup, which actually personalizes it. Suddenly there's a name. And I've always thought the power of names is something that people are generally quite bad at. I know when we go to company meetings, a lot of clients forget the whole kind of introduction, who's who thing. It's like, no, let's go around the table and let's just tell everyone's names and figure out who we all are, why we're here, and what we do.
It's fantastic, and I'm really pleased you picked on Starbucks, because Starbucks have also done tons and tons of social media around this to show that they are different, that they write your name on the cup. And it's been really clever. They've got lovely, quirky little things that add to their branding, so that you straight away think it's a personal experience, not just a very famous thing is like, have a nice day. Didn't mean anything.
Right.
Overused. Now all of a sudden they actually say good morning. Oh, what's your name? And they're actually talking to you and starting that conversation that makes you feel part of the brand. You are then an item. You're not just a customer.
It's interesting, because there's a brand here which is a cafe brand which is quite popular, called Chleb Nasishny, which is daily bread, and it's a Russian startup here. It's actually run by a German guy, but they're completely the opposite. They're waiters. I mean, they're all very polite, but they're sort of ineffective, because they have no. I don't think anyone's actually sat down with them and said, look, you're part of this organization called Daily Bread, Chleb Nasishny. This is the way we behave. This is the way we do things with our clients. You need to say hello. They're sort of indifferent and a bit rubbish. really. I mean, and it's a simple fix as well. It's just someone hasn't really thought about it, which is a shame. Because actually, it's not a bad. I mean, it's not a bad cafe, but the people, I think, just lack this direction, this kind of. They haven't had the brand kind of infused in them in some way. And tell me a little bit about ident. We were talking about idents earlier on. You were saying these are those sort of aid memoirs, the little triggers, right? The things that go ahead that suddenly make us remember.
It's really interesting. So, for example, worldwide, we've always thought of something as a logo. But actually, we don't use that word within graphics. In graphic design, we call it an ident, short for identity. Oh. And the idea is that there are different ones. This, for example, is called a logo type. It's not a whole font. You couldn't type with it. It's just 3 letters in some unique form. We all know this, the Olympics. A symbol, so a simple symbol. And then we've got such a thing as a tagline. This one I particularly love because we all know this is Nike. And this was just a really clever little thing. A lot of people ask is, why is the full stop? And it's like, well, because it just means just do it. Full stop. No argument.
Stop. Yeah.
Really simple taglines. There's different ways in which companies can start their brand. What I'm trying to get across is it's not a simple logo. It can be one of many, many things.
That's really interesting. And these are the sort of triggers. And it's quite, because we often think it's all about the logo, but you're saying actually it's not. It's about sort of key visual properties, or there could even be audio properties, I guess.
Everything. It could be a simple tune you hear. It could be the way people put the things together. Everything. This is some personal branding. I've just popped this in just to show you just all the different ways in which there's a consistency, a look and feel right the way through everything you do. As you say, triggers. Those little triggers that come through, that people could use when they actually want to get across a brand in different ways. And these are all from very small companies. You don't have to be a really, really big company. It can also be like something like a strapline, a simple strapline. This one, for example, was just get out in the rain and snow, run. Do it like your life depends on it. Well, actually, what that was Nike.
Yeah, just do it. Yeah, it's nice. Yeah, it immediately pops out, doesn't it? You get it. But also taglines. I'm a sort of great believer in taglines, which I've sort of had because I work in advertising. So the tagline has always been it's been controversial. It's sort of gone out of fashion at points in time, come back in. But actually, when used correctly, sort of like an ident, it can be very, very powerful. And also, I'm actually quite a big believer in jingles as well. If actually you start doing something with audio, sometimes it can just be a sound. I mean, we see a couple of famous a lot of famous car brands like BMW, Audi, who are using audio idents at the end of their commercials to help kind of like glue them all together.
And it's all part of that brand. It's all very clever, isn't it? The minute you hear that, you know who it is, etc., what it's exactly about. And that gives you so many new places with which you could use that brand identity. It's now suddenly not just a visual, it's audio visual. It's an experience, everything you can do to make somebody feel within a brand. We've got an interesting one in this country, and I really do apologize if it's not a company known in the UK, in Russia, but there's a company, a fashion brand called Hollister. And do you know what one of their idents is? It's actually a perfume that they spray in their shops, so that the minute you walk in, you can smell and you feel that you're in their environment, their brand. It's ever so clever.
Yeah, right. It's very neat, actually, using the senses. And I like that, actually exploiting smell. So personal branding, we talked a bit about this as well last week when we were chatting. And this is obviously very, very important. You're saying it's more important now than ever before. And regardless of where you are, what age, what stage in your career, or even kind of what you're doing, professional industry, personal branding is very key. We're on all these different social media, so we have many ways to basically implement and communicate personal branding. But also you deal with students as well, so you're sending out lots of young people into the world often starting on careers. So they're people looking to create a niche for themselves. So this obviously is something that's close to your heart, but also something you have a lot of experience with.
Yeah, to me, I mean, something I'm actually working on something with Norwegian students at the moment. I'm trying to get across them that, you know, you can be the best. What you do is not enough. And, you know, personal branding is a performance. I always feel very strongly is trying to get across to students, you know, you look good in everything you do. You makes you feel good, which actually came from a very famous rich person called Aristotle Onassis. Not many people would think about him now. I mean, he's been dead for quite a long time, actually, bless him. But he was the one who coined that phrase of, you know, he's an incredibly successful billionaire, started his business from nothing. And when he was asked, you know, what was your business all about? He said, well, you know, it's all about feeling, you look good, you feel good. And that was his whole ethos. And so I try and get across to my students, right from day one, control the narrative. And that means with the conversation, keep it simple. Don't do something very complicated. And I try and get across them something else as well. I use these as case studies, which it's all right, Michael. I'll just show a couple if that's all right, a couple of case studies. But, so, you know, this one I love. You know, you need a big budget and an even bigger team. No, just because we talked about Land Rover and other people with massive teams, you don't need that. I love this guy. If there's anyone out there, men like me who are introduced into fashion, etc., you'll know this guy, Nick Worcester. Yeah. He's called a one-man brand by the New York Times. He's a New Yorker, and he basically started off just working on the shop floor in a men's department store. And he then started to control his own narrative, what he was wearing, where he was seen, everything he does online. Nothing cost him anything. This was all about everything about him controlling, you know, that looking good, you feel good. He's now one of the leading buyers for some of the biggest fashion brands in America. All of that's happened over about a 15, 20-year period since the start of the internet. And I think that's what I'm trying to get is social media. And to me, you know, you've got to be careful because it's got a very, very long memory. I came across this on a BBC website, and it was a horrible story. It's a poor woman in America going for a job, and the first thing someone did was search for her on the internet. It's what we do. Employers do this now. So be careful with what you've got. This is a simple, nothing more than a holiday photograph, and she's being, you know, vindicated for it for putting a holiday photograph on. So be very, you know, careful about everything you put up. I've got people I work with like Johnny Hanna, a famous illustrator, who again controls the narrative. His work is beautiful, very unusual, but Johnny controls the narrative. Everything about him, the way he dresses, the way he looks, everything is getting across that whole thing. And then, Michael, you were talking about students, yeah, earlier about some of my students and some of my, you know, sort of success stories. I just want to share this one with you because I love this. Bethany studied with me about 5 years ago now, and she did a postgraduate. So she did a degree and then she did a postgraduate. And part of that was she created this whole brand of herself. She wasn't a great designer, so she kept it simple. Everything's black and white. Simple, used her own she found a lovely font just to simply do her own name. She's a photography student. She was now a photographer. Everything was in black and white, her whole brand. Everything online, which is free. There wasn't one thing she printed. She put all of this together. Everything that she joined up with, she kept the same. It's lovely for me now to go in search and talk to her on social media and realize what an impact this has had on her business. Her business has grown and grown and grown as a creative because she continuously always created the narrative. I hope that helps a little bit with it, Michael. Yeah,
it's very true. The idea of the narrative, I like that because it's a sort of, it's back to kind of the storytelling behind the personal branding, which is, it's a very interesting idea because stories is so crucial to kind of everyday life. We all love to hear a good story. So how when it comes to controlling the narrative, how do we kind of go about kind of identifying the narrative or finding the narrative?
Go back to one of the very early ones, early slides right at the beginning. But just think back to it. I put something up where I said about, you know, you've got to stand for something and you've got to keep it simple. That's, I keep saying that. So in other words, you've got to find out what you stand for. What is important to you? You know, I mean that quite genuinely. Don't think what's important to your customers first. Think about what's important to you. If you've got into a particular area, or if you're a creative that wants to work in an area, you will have something that really is important. You're doing that because you love it. So you've got to find out what it is. Once you know what it is, be consistent, and that's controlling the narrative. And what is the narrative? It's anything that goes out that's about you. So anything online, you know, anything you do to publicize yourself. But also, what I was trying to say was be careful. Make sure that everything people find about you is on that narrative, is keeping that same message going out again and again and again. And, you know, you say it enough and people will buy into it and will believe you.
That's very interesting. And you've seen that over the years. I mean, when you sort of started working with students, it was kind of all about business cards, and now it's kind of completely different, because obviously we have Instagram, TikTok, we have in Russia, we have our own versions of various things like the Kontakty, so how is it, are there any particular media platforms that are better that one should use, or
Well, that's a good question, because what will happen is, my best advice on that is constantly change. At the moment, we've got one thing is popular. I keep hearing TikTok. Everyone's talking about it. It's like, oh, it's really big. Yes, so was Facebook. So was something else. So was something else. Things change, consistently change. We've got as a university, we get students to look at one particular social media platform, and before we know it, we find out that none of them are on it anymore because they've moved on to something else. It will keep moving. There's no two ways about it. So you can't sit still. You know, we talked right at the beginning of my career, right at the very beginning, there was computers, but there wasn't an internet, or it was just in its infancy. You know, then it became really important. Then it became big to have websites. Now it's moving on to whatever is the latest social media platform. And it might be something as simple as a platform that just has text, just simple text messages. You've got to find out what it is and how you get your brand across there. And as you say, business cards, they've gone out the window. They're in some societies still used, but for the vast majority of young creatives, there's something that people just don't use anymore.
Right. Do you see any particular platforms that are more popular than others? I mean, Instagram in Russia is very big, and we don't use Twitter at all really here. So Twitter's, I mean, the UK Twitter is big, I know that, but Instagram is massive.
Instagram by far is I think is one of the most effective ones for anything. For any of us who are in a visual world, without a doubt, it's Instagram. It's but then you've also remember something. If you go onto anything like Instagram, you've got to be consistent. And that doesn't mean, oh, I keep the same message again. You means you've got to consistently put new stuff up. The people that really make Instagram and social media work well are people who work at it. And they are literally every day putting something new up. You know, that's what people are after. People will follow you because they want to see something new every single day. I've got a personal absolute favorite of a calligraphy artist who's a young Russian called Pokalampus. He's amazing.
Yeah,
it's Russian. I love him, Pokalampus. I follow him, and what I really love is that every single day there's something new he's put up. You know, about his calligraphy, about his work, maybe within fashion, within buildings, etc., architecture, or you know, he's been maybe redecorating a car. That's what I follow. It's because it's every day it's something new. There's the other word, the other side of the word, consistent. Consistently update everything you're doing.
Right. Fascinating. Okay, so we've been speaking for about 50 minutes. What I think might be good now is perhaps open the floor up to any questions, if there are any. Because we've got like about 10 minutes, 10 minutes left. So is there anything else before we go to questions? Is there anything else, Brent, that you'd like to add, or you feel that we haven't covered? I think we've done a pretty good job, actually.
I think so. I think most things about, I mean, it's been lovely to get most of this across with branding. The only thing we didn't cover was much with motion graphics. But, you know, I think that's something else that I think, you know, young creatives today know you've got to have movement in what you do. That's also part of the brand. But we did talk about audio, etc. So I think we've covered most things. And it'd be lovely to answer any questions if there are any.
I can see a question in the panel that says, "Что не так с брендингом с хлеба насущного?" Which is saying what's not right with the branding of that cafe. I can expand on that. My issue there, Daria, is I think it's a great institution. I'm a big fan. I have one near my home, so I go there quite a lot. So I experience it probably at least once or twice a week when I go and get my coffee. What they've done is they've done a very good job of getting all the product right, the coffee right. They've got great croissants. They've got a good basic menu. It's good value. The environment's nice, but they haven't worked with their people. And that is very evident when you sit down. The people are lovely. I know a lot of the waiters and waitresses in my local, and we chat, but I do notice that they're not really trained in how to kind of be consistent and perform. When I go in as part of a group of people, sometimes it takes a long time to get an order. They don't really know what the specials are. They don't really, if something's not right, they don't really know how to handle it. They just haven't been trained. No one's taken them aside and said, look, this is the way we're going to do things. It's a very interesting case actually with them, because it's a great cafe and actually a good brand generally, but that's one thing they've missed.
I'm just thinking, Michael, I'll stop sharing so that we can actually, concentrate.
Yeah, right, it's okay, yeah, because I've now got the chat up here, and just the stuff's kind of being fired at me. So we've got, hang on, I've just lost the chat. Chat, come back. Here's quite an interesting question. What is a painless way to get over a brand's bad history, particularly when we have to manage the long-term memory of social networks? How do you transform the past negative story into an advantage or get beyond it? That's a good question.
It's a great question. And do you know something? There's a brilliant example of this that's happened in the UK that I don't know if you know about, Michael. There was a very fast food network called Kentucky Fried Chicken. Has anyone heard of KFC?
Yeah, we have it here. It's big.
Brilliant. So KFC in the UK changed the company that delivered the chicken, and the company didn't deliver the chicken. And so all of a sudden, no one could get any KFC for about 2 or 3 weeks. And you think that was awful branding. But what they did was they looked at that negative and they turned it into a joke. And they changed the words to KFC to say something else. And we've messed up. And they took it on the head. They said, we've messed up and they made a joke. You can turn it around by actually admitting the problem and then turning around and actually really getting across to people that you care, that they knew that brand was wrong, and start again. And KFC, brilliant with it.
That's a great case, actually. I've seen that. They wrote FCK, didn't they, on the side of the. It was brilliant, actually.
Very clever, very, very, very clever. It's one of those.
They were open and honest, weren't they? That was the big thing there, wasn't it? They basically said, "Look, guys, we've screwed up big time. We're sorry, and we are working on trying to fix it. So be patient." So they didn't try to sort of hide the fact. They were like.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. One last thing to ask to add to that question is, you can't do it all overnight. You've got to have a plan. You've got to say, this is where we are with our brand. That's where we want to be. But this is a journey. So we need to slowly, over a period of time, and it's always different that length, change people's perception of the brand. And that can be done. That Land Rover I explained to you, that wasn't done overnight. That took about 3 or 4 years for Land Rover to get into that position.
We've got another question here. We have a question regarding career prospects. What companies are looking for in specialists today? What skills should specialists have? How did these requirements change in the last 5 to 7 years?
That's a good question. 5, 6, 7 years ago, you would have said we were all, as a graphic designer or as a copywriter, we were all literally pigeonholed. We call that as in little cubby holes that you sit in, that you can't move from. The big thing that's changed in the industry worldwide now is something called transversable skills. Companies are looking for you to be someone that that brings in transversable skills. You might be a graphic designer that's got great animation skills. You might be a photographer that's also good as a copywriter. That's what you want to be doing, getting as many transversable skills as you can, because that is what companies are looking for.
That's very interesting. So you're saying that so graphic designers need to have experience in copywriting?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely, because without a doubt, the trouble is we've always taught graphic design is very much it's this, it's only this. But the world's changing. Graphic designers are expected to come up with strap lines. And there's also something we call this convergence of the creative process. That means, as we're working in an advertising agency, and I think, Michael, you're in advertising yourself, as yourself, we get as a team. And no one knows who's going to come up with that great idea. The whole point is you work as a team. And I think that's what we're trying to do. We need to do more to work within education now, to teach people to work part of teams more.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, certainly in advertising, we all work in creative teams. And in fact, we've always had copywriters and art directors kind of working together. Now we stick in web specialists and social media people, and actually at the end of the day you don't know who has the idea, because it's all coming out as a group thing, which is interesting. And it's very interesting because you've been working quite a lot on this transferable skills thing, haven't you? This is sort of one of your specialities in your research project.
Yeah, I think it's something that I have a weakness. It's a big thing for me, because I think it's also my own background of having so many different skills. As new things came in, I had to learn. And so for me, it's something how important it is to have those transversable skills, because you've got to be able to apply for as many broad jobs as you can. If once upon a time we might say a graphics designer did this or a copywriter did that, it's gone. You said about technology coming. Everyone's got a computer now, so everyone can actually become a bit of a designer. You've got to have extra skills that people are going to look for, and you've got to be unique in what you do.
And also, that was put to good use when you went to Afghanistan, right? Because you were basically, they said you're a soldier, but actually you're a graphic designer and a communicator.
All of a sudden, they said, you've got to get the story out there, which wasn't just in Afghanistan about what was going on to people in Afghanistan, but in the UK to what we were doing there.
Right.
So controlling that narrative both ways, and it's suddenly completely new. And also, no Apple Macs, different sort of technology. Yeah. How do you do this? And it's that, again, that transversable skill. And one of the things that actually I did learn out there, I had no idea, that I actually liked taking photographs. And I started to do a lot of photography. And there's another transferable skill that I've kind of picked up since.
It's a very beautiful country, isn't it? I mean, I know we always hear negative things, but it's supposed to be stunning.
Absolutely stunning country. Yeah. I'm just looking at the conversation as well, and there's a great one here about job applicants in Russia and the UK. It's requirements. Yes, they are. I think, if I'm honest, really honest, regardless of what country you are in the world now, you've got to be known and well known online. You've got to get everything about you visually online, because trust me, people will make a decision whether to interview you really quickly, and they will go online and look at what you're doing. And you've got to be as interesting as possible. You've got to really build that brand, and that brand is you. I think that's the thing that's changed. It's no longer about great CV, getting you an interview. You know what I mean? It's not like that anymore. I think you've got to be really far more proactive.
That's interesting. So you need to have a good online presence. So it basically creates a narrative on whatever platform it is. Make sure you're there and you look appealing.
And you've got to do your research as well. This is interesting because I know Michael and I are very much from an advertising background. When we looked at clients, we would research those clients. We would find out what those clients were about. I never, ever want to walk in front of a potential client without knowing everything about them.
Yeah, so true.
And I think that's important, especially when you're young and you're coming out of your university maybe and you want to get a good job. Really go and have a look at every single company that you're interested in. You may just see an advert somewhere online for a job. Go and Google. We call it in this country, I don't know if you have Google, yeah. Search engine, go and search about that company, see their website, what have they worked on. Nothing will impress them more than you turn around saying, oh, I love that project you worked on so-and-so. Would have done it differently, but, that's what they want.
So we've got one going more to the management side here. Question at the bottom. What competencies should a brand manager have?
It's a really good one. Good. You've got to be really, really open-minded, but on top of what's happening on the internet. There's no two ways about it. That seems to be the big driving point now. You can't just be a specialist in one area or another. You mostly have got to really, really know what's going on out there in the world, because we talked about KFC earlier. That was all down to someone really understanding what was going to go on, what they could get away with within social media. You need to understand what is going on in your career at any one time, and that means, by the way, keep up with everything, for example, with publications that are talking about branding, publications that are talking about the very latest, and keep away from old books and libraries. If a book has been written and published, it's out of date.
Yes. Yeah, that's a big challenge in the teaching industry. I find that because I teach 1 day a week, and I do find you pick up a book and it's like, this is printed 2015.
Yeah, you do. And my favourite in particular is when you see a book that's on social media. It's out of date before it's even gone to print. You're looking to follow so that competencies. You're looking to be someone that is totally immersed within the industry and the culture of the industry, and that means looking at everything that's going on online. What can you do?
Yeah. Interesting one here, again from Marina Goldman. Do you think that cultural branding has its own specifics?
Yeah, it's an interesting. I just saw this in the chat, and I love the question because seeing so many different things in different cultures. We're talking about a lot of different things worldwide with the cultural misappropriation, etc. And I find, does it have its own specifics? Yes. You've got to be attuned to the culture, the culture that you're trying to actually put the branding into. It's something I often talk about. I remember a long time ago in my own career when somebody approached me to do some advertising within a market for a particular demographic of female. I had nothing to do. I couldn't do it. And I said that right from day one. I don't understand the cultural background with this. We'd have to do loads more research. And actually, we went out to an outside agency who helped us understand that culture. And that's why it's its own specifics. And it can be a real dangerous area to work in. You've got to make sure that you're dealing with somebody, or somebody's advising you, that is really immersed in it and totally understands that culture. In the same way, in my own country here, I wouldn't work on products that were aimed at sort of the black community within the UK because I don't understand it, and I can't.
Yeah, it's very interesting. You do need to be kind of within a market or within a particular context in order to properly understand it. What do you do in situations like that when you were asked, for example, in that particular feminine product example, you just say no or bring in someone else? Or
I think what's really important, actually, with everything, as a creative, you've got to be honest. And you've got to realise when you're honest, it will last you, it'll do 10 times better. So the products I'm talking about, which was actually, it was a product for a lovely woman came to us, wanted us to work on a product that we said we don't understand. We were really honest. We put her in touch with somebody else. She actually recommended us to other companies because she said, my God, they're fantastic. They'll tell you the truth.
Right.
Funny enough, I realised afterwards, we've just built our brand. By being honest, by not taking every job that you think you can, when you know straight away, I can't do this. It's really worth it in the long time because it's actually
honesty is generally a good policy. We always say that to our clients as well. It's like, if something goes wrong, or just be honest, because normally when you start spinning lies or stories, it always comes back and bites you in the end, and then one non-truth it all gets out of control, and it's it becomes a mess.
It's very interesting. So,
so I think so that's all the questions I've got here. So I don't know if there's anything else anyone wants to add. Otherwise, I think it's probably time to wrap up. I've seen we're 6 minutes over the hour. It's been a fascinating time with you, Brent. You've shared with us all sorts of great stories. I've actually learnt interesting from you today. I hadn't realized the Land Rover logo is the same, and I myself drive a Land Rover.
That makes two of us.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, and it's actually a big popular brand out here in Russia because we have Russian winters and Russian roads. But thank you very, very much. It's been very, very insightful. It's been very broad. It's been very relevant, and it's been a lot of fun. So thank you very much.
I've really, really enjoyed it. I just want to say thank you to everyone. It's the first time I've ever spoken to Russian students, and I really love the questions. It's been so exciting for me, and always be welcome to do something like this again. So thank you for having me.
Great. Thank you, Brent. Thank you so much.
Brent, Mike, I would like to thank you from Universal University and the Cultural Education section of the British Embassy in Moscow for this very exciting and very informative and inspiring session. It was a real pleasure for us to have you with us today, and your insights were really very helpful and interesting. And I would like to remind our audience that they are able to apply to either Mike's course at the British High School of Art and Design in Moscow, or to apply to Solent University, to Brent's course in the UK, so you are very welcome too. And I will switch to Russian for some words in the end to end the session. Друзья, спасибо вам большое за ваш интерес к мероприятию Utalks.Boundaryless, цикл онлайн-эфиров с международными экспертами, который пройдет в течение этого года, и он пройдет вместе с Universal University и различными культурными институциями стран. Первый университет креативных индустрий в России, Universal University, проведет в течение ближайшего времени дополнительные мероприятия вместе с отделом культуры и образования Посольства Великобритании в Москве. Следите за нашими анонсами. В следующую среду пройдет бесплатная онлайн-дискуссия на тему креативного предпринимательства совместно с университетом Goldsmith. Мы будем вас ждать и в ближайшее время анонсируем все наши следующие эфиры. Спасибо вам большое. Я хотела бы еще раз напомнить, что сегодня с нами был Брент Мейхью, декан факультета визуальных коммуникаций, дизайна, прикладных искусств в университете Solent, и модератор нашей сегодняшней сессии Майкл Гибсон, преподаватель программ бакалавриата по маркетингу, рекламе и диджитал-маркетингу в Британской школе дизайна. Будем рады видеть вас на наших следующих эфирах. Спасибо вам большое.